Hello everyone, my name is Keith Vinci and I am the Director of the Geographic Health Equity Alliance and one of two speakers who will lead you through this particular training. A three-part webinar series has been developed to provide grantees of the Iowa Department of Public Health's Division of Tobacco Use Prevention coalition capacity building skills that directly align with Goal 4, coalition development of their annual state-issued work plan. This particular webinar, is the first of three. Shown here are the topics we will cover in this webinar, including the collaborators who made it possible, the purpose of the entire series, and a brief introduction of the speakers providing the information. This webinar series was made possible with the collaboration of Siglinda Prior, the Executive Officer of the Division of Tobacco Use Prevention and Control within the Iowa Department of Public Health, myself, Keith Vinci, the Director of the Geographic Health Equity Alliance, which is a CDC-funded national network within CADCA, and Dave Chevelle, an independent contract trainer and consultant working on behalf of CADCA's National Coalition Institute. This webinar series was developed as a direct response to a 29-question survey administered to the Iowa Department of Public Health's community partners to determine the grantees' specific coalition capacity building skills needs, that is. The series was also developed to support community partners' work in realizing Goal 4, which is coalition development outlined in Iowa's strategic plan. The intended goal of the series include not only ensuring community partners achieve Goal 4, but also to improve their engagement of coalitions that are interested in or currently working on the National Tobacco Control Program goal areas. Dave Chevelle is an independent contract trainer and consultant with over 25 years of experience in providing training, technical assistance, and consulting services in state and community coalitions, capacity building skills, and substance abuse prevention assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation. Chevelle has worked full-time with CADCA's National Coalition Institute since 2007, working directly with numerous community coalitions throughout the United States. I, Keith Vinci, serve as Director of GEA, overseeing the strategic and operational responsibilities of CADCA's Geographic Health Equity Alliance, or GEA. Prior to my tenure with CADCA, I worked within state government and with external partners to implement population-based programs and services, as well as healthcare business strategies aimed at reducing tobacco use in the states of Georgia and Alabama. Shown here as a recap are the individual activities associated with IDPH's Goal 4 coalition development. It is the goal of this webinar series to support each of these activities through the teachings provided by Dave. As a reminder, we have on the screen the three CDC goal areas around which most of your work has been developed. With the teachings and supplementary materials offered by this webinar series, the goal is to also support the achievement of these goal areas in the long term. Now that I've led us through the introduction of the series, the players who work to make it happen, and recap key goal areas, I will hand over the webinar to Dave Chevelle, who will take you through the training materials and teachings slated for the first of three webinars. Dave?
Well, thank you very much, Keith. And again, this is Dave Chevelle. I'm calling you from Portland, Oregon, is where I live, and we're having a typical Northwest rainy day here. Hope things are better with you in Iowa. And I want to thank you, Keith, for you at CADCA, the Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America, and your partners at the Iowa Department of Public Health for providing this opportunity. I look forward to spending some time, the next portion of this first webinar, with you all, sharing some information about some of the research that we've learned and a lot from our experience in working with over 5,000 coalitions in the United States and across the world as well. And as we go through the rest of this webinar, I encourage all the participants to use the PowerPoint that was provided with the webinar. We provided a PDF format So you can take notes as we go through here. That's available to you. Also encourage you to look at and download the workbook that is provided in a Word format. This workbook includes many of the tools and additional information, and it's provided in Word so you can go ahead and change them and customize the materials for your work in the communities. And so this first presentation is about building coalitions, and so we just want to start with by asking, how can coalitions help? And when you think about the work you're doing, when we talk about creating a comprehensive program using a comprehensive support of the Division of Tobacco Use Prevention and Control of their strategies, comprehensive means community-wide. And so we need to be able to engage many sectors of the community in doing this work. It's not just one organization doing the work. We need to be flexible to understand what's happening in our communities, what are the existing policies and resources in the community, and we need to really engage local partners, local policymakers, local lawmakers in doing some of this work. And that, again, is not the sole responsibility of any one organization in the community. It's the role of a coalition, which is composed of many different agencies, organizations, and individuals who can come together to do this work. So that's the benefit of a coalition. And so if we look and really at a definition of what is a coalition, we can say a coalition, and I'll read this to you. A coalition is a voluntary formal agreement and collaboration between groups or sectors of a community in which each group retained its identity but all agreed to work toward a common goal of building a safe, healthy, and drug-free community. And so some of the key elements of this definition of how a coalition can help and what is a coalition, it is a voluntary organization where people come together because they care about a common goal. And people are volunteering, if you will. There may be some funding available. There may not be a lot of funding available. They come together to work toward a common goal. In our cases, it's to work with some of the tobacco use and control goals that we've identified. So it's people coming together where each group retained its identity, and that's critical because each of the partners, each of the sectors involved in doing this work will be involved in implementing strategies. It's not going to fall on only upon schools or only upon the public health departments or only upon human services to do this work. It's each group playing their role in shaping the policies and implementing programs and strategies throughout the community. So that's really why we have a coalition of people coming together to address these common goals. And so what will coalitions do? They will work together to achieve these goals that have been identified here. And when you think about it, each of these goals to diversify representation and get more people involved in it, this really entails engaging grassroots members of our community, engaging members of the health community, engaging members of the education community at all three levels, primary, secondary, and the college, the higher education level. It's to be able to build on existing strategies that you have in place, build on existing funding and resources that already are in place to address tobacco, and build and expand upon those, and to really counter, and this is why it's important to be done at the community level, to counter some of the strategies and tactics, if you will, that the tobacco industry engages in. And that varies by community. So that's why another reason why it's so important to have local coalitions involved in this effort. And so when we talk about coalitions, and this is important, you may know what a coalition, you may have a good idea. However, as we're recruiting new people to join the coalition, they may have been involved with different types of coalitions, they may have different ideas. So it's important as part of our communication and sharing what is a coalition to be able to talk about the different types of coalitions or different activities that coalitions have involved in. And it's really a continuum, starting with, on the left-hand side here, an activity or event-focused coalition. This is where a group of people come together to put on a specific event. It may be to put on a smokeout, a community smokeout event, or it could be around Alcohol Awareness Week or around certain events that happen in a community. A service or delivery-focused coalition is focused on providing, and best example is providing a curriculum in the school, or they may be providing a cessation program. So that's very specific on reaching specific target audiences with specific skills and information that we're providing. A third type of coalition is one that's involved in community mobilization. This is where it may be around changing policy in a community, whether it's tobacco-free zones, having individual organizations develop tobacco-free policies, and implementing and enforcing those policies. That's where it's focused on a specific task of getting a policy or an initiative passed. And so when you think about the work that we have to do in our tobacco use and control coalitions, it's really about comprehensive doing all of these, doing activities, doing services or strategies, mobilizing the community around policy. So we're involved in a comprehensive effort to address tobacco use in our community. And so it's important as we're recruiting new people and engaging people that we explain that we're involved in all this work, and so there's ample opportunity for folks to get involved. They may want to be involved with an activity or with a service delivery or with policy, and we're engaged in doing all that. So it's important to, first of all, have this understanding of the different types of coalitions. And then as we're recruiting people and we're forming our coalition and we're sharing with people in the community what our coalition is doing, it's important to be clear about what is the role of the tobacco control coalitions. And so the next little bit we're going to be talking about how coalitions operate, what are some of the tools that they use, how they go about doing the work. And again, this is all important as we're recruiting people, letting them know what we're doing and how they can get involved. So the first element of any coalition is to have a clearly defined community. And this is very important for several reasons. The first is when we have a clearly defined community, it could be a city or a town or a county or a multi-county level endeavor. That tells us what are the jurisdictions that need to be involved. If we're a county level organization, then we're doing policy at the city level, then we need to be engaging all the different cities. We also need to be engaging different school districts if we're providing education through health classes in the school or through counselors in the school. Those are the jurisdictional boundaries and entities. And also it's very important as we're reaching out to grassroots, to members of the community, to identify the communities within the community. This has to do with the culture and diversity within a community, that we need to make sure that the information we're providing and all of our efforts are culturally responsive. And so we need to reach out to members of the diverse communities that exist in our defined community and make sure that we're engaging them not in being recipients of this information, but all the way through the entire process from the assessment, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So that's why it's very important to be identifying, first of all, what is this community that we're serving? And then the second element is the recognition of the approach that we're using. And many of you have heard of the public health approach, and we know that the public health approach is really looking at three elements, and we know it's the agent, the host, and the environment. And so it's important for us, again, as we're recruiting people, to know that again, when we talk about tobacco use, and I'll use the young people, for example, if a young person is living in a community and they're not exposed to tobacco, if they can't get their hands on tobacco, which is the agent, then they're not going to have a tobacco problem. But we do know that youth are exposed to tobacco and that they do come across friends or parents or family members, or it's available from retail establishments. So they are exposed to it. And so they are exposed to it not in isolation, but in a broader community, a community that may, I don't want to say promotes tobacco use, but may allow tobacco use by people. Or there may be some communities that are very health conscious and they have taken community stand against tobacco use and the dangers associated with it. And so when you think about it, there's going to be individual focused strategies, so giving young people in this example the skills, the knowledge, the information they need so they can make healthy decisions. And then there's the community-wide environmental approach saying, how do we change this environment so youth don't have access to tobacco, so youth aren't exposed to adults using tobacco and secondhand smoke? And really, so the role of a coalition is to look at all of that. Our different member or sector organizations will be looking at elements of this community environment, but the coalition is looking at the entire environment and identifying, okay, based on our local individual community, what are some things that we can do to, again, reduce the youth exposure and increase youth and others' knowledge of tobacco and its consequences?
Hey, Dave, I want to just jump in here and pose a question. So,
certainly.
what if tobacco, as we know, remains an issue in many communities across the country? What if tobacco is an issue in a particular community, but is not at the forefront? How do, as a coalition member, or a leader of a coalition, how do we sort of put that on everyone's radar? And you may touch on this later in the training.
Thank you, Keith. That's an excellent question. And it comes up a lot now. We all know that prescription drug abuse is a big issue in the community, and even coalitions that are focusing on alcohol abuse are, I don't want to use the word competing, but their people's attentions are placed elsewhere. I think the point is when there is a coalition in a community that, and we're going to get to this, the needs assessment piece is so important to identify what is the extent of tobacco use, what is the extent of alcohol use. Let people know that there are numbers of people. And what we find is that typically tobacco use numbers will be higher than some of the prescription drug abuse, which may be a bigger issue in the media in the community. So collecting data is a very important way of raising the awareness. Also, it is important that when we do the resource assessment as part of the assessment, to identify who's already working with tobacco so we can, as a coalition, continue to support those resources, those agencies, organizations, individuals who are already addressing tobacco. And so what some coalitions do, and we're going to get to this later, is they may form a tobacco work group. And so that way, while the coalition may be addressing other issues, there is a work group, a task force, a subcommittee, whatever you want to call it, an action team, whatever you want to call it, that is focusing on supporting existing resources and expanding resources around tobacco. That's an excellent question, and many communities are dealing with that question. Thank you, Keith. So again, I just mentioned the planning process. Another element of doing this work with the coalition is that it is guided by an effective planning process. And there's many different processes out there. This is it's variously called it is called the Strategic Prevention Framework by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Really what it is, what they've developed is to create a common language among different grantees, among different coalitions in the community. And it is essentially a planning process that we all engage with, which includes assessment of the community. Again, we don't do statewide assessments and only rely on those. We need to assess the community, look at what capacity we have in the community, what resources we have, do planning based on our knowledge of those individual and environmental factors that we've identified in our community. Based on those plans, do implementation and evaluate it. And we need to do that with cultural competence in mind, meaning understanding what those grassroots and communities within the communities with different aspects of their culture. And if we're effective at doing that, then we'll develop prevention efforts and other efforts that are sustainable, that will continue because people have worked together and established processes that can continue over the long term. Because that's what it's going to take to achieve some of these goals that we set up for ourselves. So another element besides, again, looking at a defined community, using a public health approach, using a well-thought-out process. Another element of the work the coalition is doing is developing products. And this is just it is fairly busy schematic, but it's saying that there are products that we develop that we then can share with various members of the community in the different sectors in our community. So these products include our community assessment, a logic model. Logic models can look at various formats. Comprehensive strategies, we'll be talking about those, how we develop strategies that address both those individual environments and also the community-wide environment. And those are all based on our objectives and our goals of what it is we want to achieve. So some of the other webinars will be walking through this process. The key point is that a role of the coalition is to develop these products and to share these products with members of the community and sectors of the community so they can play their role in addressing the objectives and goals that we've established. So the next element of a coalition work is to, and we've talked about this, engage community sectors. We know it's not the role of any one specific organization, and so there's a range of sectors. This colorful diagram we're looking at is a sector wheel. And all this really just identifies that each sector, whether it's health or business or media or the faith community or youth-serving organizations or seniors or law enforcement. They all play a role in this. They may not be involved in every single strategy, but they all can play a role in identifying and implementing specific strategies. So it's important as we're developing our coalition, as we're developing our plans and moving into implementation, that we reach out and engage these sectors in doing our work. And we will be talking about this more in detail, and we've got some tools out there that define some of these sectors. The point is, coalitions are composed of many of these different sectors. And just for example, some of you may be aware of the Drug-Free Community Coalition that's funded through the Office of National Drug Control Policy and SAMHSA. That particular grant, which is targeted toward community coalitions, requires the involvement of 12 different sectors. That way we're guaranteed to have input and be able to access the resources of a variety of sectors in the work that we're doing. And so just to let us know that the sectors tend to be organizational, we also want to remember that we are looking to address those with their feet on the ground, those who are involved with grassroots. So when we talk about education, we're not only talking about engaging the school superintendent, we're also talking about engaging principals and teachers in each school building and the PTA and the students themselves in this. So we're talking about at each level in each of our sectors, who are the people that really represent both who are going to be involved in the development of strategies, but also who may be some of the clients or some of the recipients of these services. We want to make sure that we reach out to as broad a possible set of sectors in engaging in this work. And what that really does, that gives the community a voice in addressing these issues that are very important to the overall health of the community. There's one other element that's important for coalitions to consider, and it's very important in our work in tobacco control. And this model that we're looking at here is based on the Institute of Medicine. It's been updated several times, and it's called the continuum of care. And the point about this is as we're looking at doing this work, we're looking at a broad range of strategies across the entire continuum. And you'll notice the continuum moves from general health promotion, which is providing information about what are good health practices, to prevention, intervention, treatment, and maintenance. And so when you think about it, the role of a coalition is there's not any one organization involved in doing all of these. So part of the coalition's role is to pull members of the community who are doing health promotion. That may be the schools, or it may be the health department. Who are doing prevention. That may be youth-serving organizations or businesses or whoever's engaged. And we have treatment providers, those who are providing assessment or cessation services. And those that are supporting people in thereafter they've gone through treatment, they've gone through their cessation, how we support them and create an environment that supports not engaging in the problem behavior, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, or other drugs. And so, again, the role of the coalition is we need to be able to consider all of these, clarify our role in which of these we're going to take on, and then engage sectors or individuals and organizations who can play a role in each of these elements of this continuum of care. So you didn't know there's a lot of work for coalition to do, a lot for us to be involved in. And so part of it is, and again, that's why we need coalition, because it is too much work for any one organization. And part of that work is, and we talked about this, is providing specific strategies. And this slide talks about two general types of strategies, those being strategies that target the individual environment. Here's where we're providing services and information directly to young people, directly to individuals. People are talking about cessation services, providing those directly to individuals. And it can be provided to our partners, whether it's family service providers, the schools, the faith community, healthcare providers, anybody who has access to individuals and families, they can provide these sorts of information and services. Whereas when we talk about that broader community environment, we're really talking about changing our policies, changing norms, changing availability. Again, here's where we involve similar sectors, in addition to some of the alcohol enforcement, alcohol control, and that varies by each state and each community. And so if we're talking about regulations, we need to be able to, for instance, if retailers are selling tobacco products to minors, we need to make sure that we're doing compliance checks, that we're providing training to the retailers so that they can properly check an ID and refuse service, that if vendors do violate the rules and the laws and they sell to minors, are they going to get caught? What are consequences? Will they eventually lose their license if licensing is required in a community? So again, those are more policy-based when we talk about smoke-free zones. Those are more policy-based. So the role of the coalition is to, working with our sectors, look at both sides of this, the individual-focused strategies and the environmental strategies. And so the next slide really talks about what are some examples of those. And some of these are going to be just examples here that you may be familiar with are alcohol-specific. Or some of these are going to be general prevention activities. So again, media literacy, school curriculum, whether it's a health curriculum. You can look at every one of these is focused on providing information and skills to individuals or to groups of individuals. These tend to be individual-focused strategies. When we talk about environmental strategies, these tend to be more, again, looking at policies in the community. An example here is where we see some that are alcohol-based, others are tobacco-based, others, again, and the whole point of it is to say we don't need to take on every one of these policies. It's what policies, after we've done our assessment, what policies are going to be most appropriate for our community. So again, the role of the coalition is to look at the overall environment, identify individual and environmental strategies that we can put in place. And so if we do all that, these are some of the outcomes that we can achieve. So some of the outcomes are going to be the reduction in tobacco use, the initiation, the exposure to secondhand smoke, and the cessation efforts, the quitting of tobacco use. Also, in what we've seen in all our coalitions work, that there's other broader benefits around community building, bringing people together to address positive and try to achieve positive outcomes. That always brings the community together. We found also that by focusing on youth and some of our prevention, it really we're building the future of our communities by encouraging youth and engaging youth in healthy and drug-free activities. That's only going to support their development and their success throughout their lives.
Hi, Dave. This is Keith again. I wanted to jump in and ask you a question about something.
Sure.
So you mentioned the strategies, the individual-based and the community-based strategies, to take us back a couple of slides. And you also talked about tying those strategies to community assessments that different coalitions should conduct when they are setting their activities and things as such. So if you're in a situation where your community assessment is telling you to focus on certain strategies, and there may not be as ideal of an infrastructure in place to focus on those, what type of advice do you have for different coalition members and leaders around how best to move forward in that particular situation?
And we will be talking about this in some of the other webinars. Then it's really several things. One, it's the prioritization process. As you've done your assessment and you're moving into the strategy piece, is to be able to say which of these strategies can we implement now? Which strategies do we have the resources for? And that's looking at not only funding, but also what resources our partners have. And so it's part of that prioritization process around what is best to do at this point. The other point is by engaging the broader community in doing the assessment and planning, that gives us a lot more leverage in going to various funders, various organizations that may provide resources, that may have, or it may be about political will to put in a policy. And so when we have the broader community support and the broader community engagement, it makes it a lot easier to highlight our causes, to highlight these strategies, these policies we want to put in place in our community. So it's really, that all points to the benefits of a coalition. It's not one individual, one organization supporting this. It's a broad collaboration of people from throughout the community. Does that get at your question?
Yes, it does. And my apologies if I'm jumping ahead. I'm pretty sure we'll get to some of that in webinars 2 and 3, but I just wanted to sort of toss that out there right now just in case there are some listeners or viewers who may be thinking that. So thanks for that, Dave. I appreciate it.
And that's important because this first part that we've just gone through, the first part of this webinar, is really laying the foundations of what coalitions do, what are coalitions, and what are some of the things that, the work that they need to do. That's important as we're recruiting people, as we're engaging people in doing this work, engaging organizations in doing this work. So what I would encourage you to continue this discussion as we're recruiting people and engaging people, some people may say, well, really, what's the difference between a coalition and a program? And there's a detail on the slide, and it's really about, when you look at the right-hand side, programs, a program tends to be targeted toward a specific audience around changing a specific behavior or changing a specific knowledge. Think about a cessation program. That's targeted toward people who are smoking and are addicted to tobacco in the community. If we're talking about Clean Air Act or smoke-free zones, that's focusing on a specific program or specific activity. If we're focusing on a curriculum in the school, that's really addressing one specific aspect of a strategy or one specific aspect of our goals. And it's when we get to that level of a program, it's really where specified staff or volunteers are working specifically toward that task. A coalition, on the other hand, is looking at much broader issues. They're looking at a whole range of elements of the community and identifying which multiple programs can we implement. And so the coalition may not be responsible for the actual program implementation. The coalition may be responsible for identifying the programs, and then different partners and collaborators within the community will do the actual program implementation. So the coalition, the actors, are really composed of the broad sectors of the community coming together to identify what is it that we want to focus on. And another question that folks may have as we recruit them, what's the difference between a coalition and a nonprofit agency? And there may be a little bit less distinction here, as some coalitions themselves are nonprofits. The typical nonprofit is really focused on a specific challenge or goal that they're targeting and addressing, a specific mission and vision, and they have a staff, paid staff, and board of directors who are working toward implementing strategies to achieve that particular mission and vision. Whereas a coalition is looking at a much broader, tends to look at a much broader aspect of the community and and is more organic in doing its work, how we can work with volunteers to get involved in doing this work. Many coalitions operate without funding, without a formal board of directors. They'll have a separate fiscal agent if they do have funding, but they're a little bit they can be a little bit less formal. So coalitions, again, some may become nonprofits when they start out, but typically just a group of people organically and formally coming together to address a common goal. These are important considerations as we're recruiting people, and they're asking questions about what is a coalition, how is it different from a program, how might it be different from a nonprofit. And so in summary, as I was saying, these are all the benefits of working as a coalition. And you can read through these, and really it's important that as we're working with our members and recruiting new sectors, new members, it's important to be able to articulate what are some of the, as I mentioned, the roles of a coalition, what is a coalition, what are some of the benefits of a coalition. So what I encourage you here, if you're doing this as a recording, is you might even pause the recording here and stop for a minute and take some notes that if you are going to go out and recruit somebody or make a presentation at a local Rotary Club, what would you say based on what we talked about here? What are some of the key points you would say about what is the role of a coalition? What does a coalition do? How do we go about doing the work? Who's involved in a coalition? So again, you may pause here, and then we'll move into the second part of this particular webinar. So as we move into the second part of the webinar, we're going to spend more time talking about in a lot more detail building capacity to do the work of a coalition. And you see here is our strategic prevention framework, or some coalitions call it their bubble chart or their flower chart. And what this really is, though, a lot of coalitions call it their planning wheel. It's really, when we talk about building coalition capacity, it's capacity to do the work. And so depending on which phase we're in, whether it's assessment, planning, implementation, evaluation, we're building capacity to do that level of work. And a way that we at CATCA has put out a primer that addresses this. And so what we're going to be talking about is based on the primer. I encourage you to go out to www.catka.org, and you can download this primer and a primer for each of the elements of the Strategic Prevention Framework. The primer talks about building a vision and mission, and we're going to be talking about building leadership, membership, organization, and cultural competence. So that's what we talk about. In order to do the work of a coalition, we need to have a vision and mission. We need to have leaders. We need to have members involved. We need to be organized, and we need to do that with and be culturally competent as we do it. These are all discussed in the primer series provided by CATCA. And so one of our, I'll say our mantra for coalition capacity building is that form follows function. This is what I was talking about. Depending on which element of the strategic prevention framework are in, our coalition may look a bit different. We might have different members involved if we're doing it when we're in the assessment phase, as when we move into planning or when we move into implementation. We may be organized differently. When we're in the planning phase, we might have two different work groups, one doing focus groups, one doing data collection through surveys. As we move into planning, then we may develop different planning work groups. When we move into implementation, we may develop different groups based on the strategy. So we may have a policy work group, an education work group, and a cessation work group. So again, the whole point is that there's not one proper or best form for a coalition. It depends what the coalition's doing, and that also drives how formal a coalition do we make. We'll be talking about that. And another way of looking about this is the coalition building is about getting the right person to the right meeting at the right time. So again, depending on what we're involved in, who's the right people to be involved in that particular effort of the coalition. And so the first element of any successful coalition, and the research clearly builds this out, is having a core group of committed leaders. And these leaders can be both positional leaders, whether it's the superintendent of schools or the director of the public health department or law enforcement or business leaders or health practitioners. So those are organizational leaders. There may also be informal leaders. And when some communities, they said if you want to go talk to the leaders, you go down to the coffee shop at 7:30 in the morning and the four guys in the corner booth, they're the ones to talk to. So we recognize, or maybe one of our trainers refers to Ma Davis, who lives on the corner of 5th and Main. If you're going to do anything in this community, you need to have Ma Davis involved. So it all depends on your community. The whole point is that we engage these leaders because they're the ones who can sway community opinion. They're the ones who can demonstrate that, yes, this is a cause that we need to be able to talk about. And Keith, it, in a way, gets back to your question you asked earlier about what if tobacco isn't necessarily the biggest issue in our community. Here's a role for leadership to play and to highlight that, yeah, tobacco, I just saw a statistic that tobacco, it was a high number, 33% of all fatalities are related to tobacco. We need to address that, and leaders are a wonderful way to raise that awareness in the community. So if we look at what, yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Dave, would you also put in this category community champions?
Thank you. That's on my notes here. I didn't mention it. Community champions are clearly a term that we use. These are people that may not be a positional leader, but they care about substance abuse. They care about tobacco use. And there may also be another term we use, are community members, or sometimes some people are called a spark plug. This is the person who may work in the health department. They may not be the leader, but they're the person that knows everybody in the community. They're the person that can get work done. And so we need champions, we need spark plugs. And what we just talked about is establishing a group of, could be just 4 to 5 people. These are the people that are going to lead this effort as the coalition does its work. Thank you, Keith. Absolutely. And so once the one role of the leadership is to work with the community and to develop a vision. And we're not going to train here how to develop a vision. If you do need assistance in that, there may be assistance available in Iowa, but also let you know about CATCA has a technical assistance arm at 1-800-54-CATCA extension 240. And CATCA's technical assistance manager can help you with anything related to what we're talking about. But as we all know, a vision is what our picture of what our community, what we want it to look like in the future. So it's what we're starting with our assessment. Here's where we are now. What do we want to look like 10, 15 years down the road? And so vision tends to use adjectives. Vision for Acme County is a healthy, vibrant, alcohol, tobacco, and other drug-free community. So it talks about what we want to achieve in the future, whereas the mission statement talks about what will be the coalition's role. And it explains, it typically uses verbs to describe how the coalition will do this work. The example we provide here, the ACME Coalition engages residents in the process of ongoing community problem solving. So again, if you ask what this coalition does, what do? We do community problem solving. So here's where you can put in terms like we provide education, we educate, we build skills in young people so they make healthy decisions. We do policy work to change local and individual organizational policies. So here's where we say how the coalition works to obtain and achieve the vision that we've identified. And so that's one of the roles that leadership can play, is establishing that mission and vision. So what we're going to do now is just talk about the different roles of people on the coalition and what the roles people play. And so we've talked a little bit about coalition leadership. Coalition leadership is really the catalyst for making sure the coalition is successful. So they're involved in all aspects of the coalition, from recruiting new people, from being spokespeople for the coalition. And this is even more important as the coalition is getting started. And as the coalition evolves and becomes more mature, then the leadership will fall into more delegating and more supervising and managing. But at the start, the leaders are the people who are doing this work. If the coalition is fortunate enough to have staff, obviously the leadership will be responsible for managing that staff. Some coalitions choose, especially when they're starting out, to have informal leadership groups. I know some coalitions, they have started with 4 or 5 leaders. Those leaders will remain the leaders all the way through. Another coalition didn't have that leader, was 1 or 2 people. So what they've established was a leadership team. The leadership team meets the week before the coalition meeting, and that leadership team is responsible for setting the agenda for the meeting, identifying what points will be talked about, and we'll talk a lot about the process of the work that will occur. That way it's not a staff person or any 1 or 2 people leading it. It's engaging the community members in doing this work. And incidentally, one group that I'm thinking of, they formed a leadership team, and they just said anybody who wants to come the week before our coalition meeting where we're going to do this planning. And I actually attended the meeting. At that first meeting, 18 people showed up at 7:30 in the morning, and as it turns out, I've been in touch with that coalition. They're still meeting the week before their coalition meetings, and they regularly get 15 to 18 people at that leadership team. They've chosen not to formalize their leadership. They're keeping it informal. Other coalitions tend to formalize their leadership, and it's helpful if you're writing grants where you have a board of directors or a steering committee, and you can have roles on that steering committee with a chairperson, a vice chairperson, etc. The degree of formality can depend on the coalition, and also as the coalition evolves over time, coalitions can get more formal in their leadership. Next element is looking at coalition members. This is what we're always looking for, and it's when we're recruiting members, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, is recruiting members to do the work. If someone asks, what's your role in the coalition, and you say, well, my role is to show up every Wednesday, every 3rd Wednesday of every month and eat their chicken sandwich, that's not really a role on the coalition. What we want is to say, my role, I'm involved on these committees, or I do this work, or I meet with the leadership team. So we participate, we're recruiting members to participate in doing the work. They can take the work back to their individual organizations and sectors and share the work with the coalition. So the leaders recruit the members to do the work, and the members eventually can become the leaders of the coalition. And the members can be involved. And when we talk about being a member, it doesn't mean you're attending every single meeting. It means you're attending those meetings based on the work. So there may be some coalition members that never attend the regular coalition meeting, but they're on the assessment work group, and they play an active role on that assessment work group. So each individual can decide how they want to be involved in the coalition.
Hey, Dave, I want to jump in and ask you a question here. So when we talk about coalition leaders and coalition members, how important is it to draw a line between the two, or is that sort of fluid? I know that you just mentioned that some members will eventually go on to be leaders, but outside of that transition, talk to us about the importance of keeping those two roles different, or if it's advantageous, allowing some fluidity in those roles.
Again, as I mentioned, coalitions tend to become more formal over time, especially as they start to write for grants and they get different funding. Funders want to know that there's leadership involved. And so it typically does, as the coalition matures, there is this leadership group. And it's important to have that leadership group because they provide the continuity. The leadership group, a lot of coalitions, and in the tools that we provided, there's some job descriptions there. The leadership, we tend to ask them to commit to 1 to 2 year involvement with the coalition, commit to attending regular meetings as often as they can. So to answer your question specifically, it is important to have that committed group of people who will provide the continuity. And so members may come and go depending on the different roles that they're involved with the coalition. We'll also talk about this when we talk about the org chart as well.
Okay.
So as I haven't mentioned this before, but if you look in the workbook that we provided, there are some sample job descriptions that do clarify what are potential roles for leadership roles and also some potential roles for members to be involved with the coalition. And then finally, if your coalition has staff, one of the things that we found, and this is where coalitions tend to differ from programs or nonprofit organizations, is the staff's role is not to do all the work. I know several coalitions that they're operating very fluently with all volunteers. They write a grant, they get the grant, and they say, okay, now that we have staff, the staff will do all the work, and the members fall off. That's not why we have a coalition. That's not why we hire staff. The role of the staff is to really empower and support the coalition members to do more work. Staff can take on and coordinate a lot of the communication activities between the work groups. The coalition staff can make sure that members have the skills and the training so that they can do the work. And so it really is important to, as coalitions do have paid staff, or they do acquire paid staff, is that the staff is really clear that their role is not to do the work, but to support members in doing that work. And so the next piece is here to be able to talk about, as we're recruiting people to become members to do this work of a coalition, what are some of the tools that we have in place that can support that recruiting process? And so one is the different sectors, and as you can see here, there's a range of sectors. And if you turn in the workbook, there's a community sector worksheet. And this worksheet provides just a list of sectors. So again, as your coalition's defining work, we're going to be implementing this public awareness campaign that includes social media, that includes billboards, that includes PSAs, public service announcements on the radio. We're doing this public awareness campaign. Who do we need to recruit? What sectors might be the best sectors? We want to have business involvement. We want to have media involvement. We're going to be educating in the schools. We need schools involvement. So we can use this form to say, who do we already have involved? And then who might be some additional people that we need to involve in our work. So the sector worksheet is a nice tool. Another tool that can help us in doing this work is to look at the different skills and organization and resources that we need to do this work. So looking at the resources to identify, it can be not just money, but it can be what facilities do we need, what skills do we need. If we're doing that public awareness campaign, we may need someone with expertise in putting together a website or putting together a Twitter campaign where we're going to be doing periodic tweets around some of the messages we're putting out. And so the coalition may not have the members, but we can go out and recruit members to do that work. And so we provide a community resources worksheet that supports and just allows you to say, okay, what are some of these resources that we need? And so what this becomes now, instead of just going to, I'll say, the Rotary, if we want to recruit members, we could go to the Rotary and say, hey, we've got this great coalition. We'd love to have you come to our meetings. All of you are invited to come to our meeting. We meet the third Tuesday of every month. Well, and if we do that, it's really, who knows who's going to show up. But if we go to the Rotary or to the leaders of the Rotary and say, we're doing this media campaign, and we're looking for someone to join us in helping to put together the social media messages. Do you know anybody that can help us with that? We're more likely to be able to identify one or two members of that Rotary who may be able to help us in doing that. They can volunteer. We can describe the benefits to them of why they become involved. And this is, again, this worksheet's allowing us to say, to do our work, what skills, resources do we need? Which then leads us to the concept of what we call targeted recruiting. And so this is where, when I first started in coalition work, I want to say 25 years ago, we used to just put flyers up all over town and broadcast everywhere, come to our coalition meeting. And so I remember in one community, we put that up. We had 40 people come to our meeting, and we talked about bylaws and engaging in an assessment and planning process. Well, we did that at the next meeting. We had 5 people come back. And so when we talk about targeted recruiting is when, depending on what we're doing in the coalition planning process, planning, assessment, implementation, evaluation, whatever we're doing, we recruit people to do that work. So we identify and target to say who can help us to do this particular task that we're taking on. So if you look at the member recruiting worksheet, with this, just a tool that allows you to be able to say, if you look at the center column, what is the level of involvement that we want to have, meaning what skills, knowledge, resources do we need to do this work, and then you can say on the left-hand side who might be an individual and organization that we could recruit, and then if we are going to recruit them, the with them is what's in it for me, how will they benefit from their involvement in this work. So if we're asking a business to join in, we need to be able to describe what benefits they get. They'll be able to share their products, and again, to network with others in the community. We will be able to list them in all our publication that they volunteered with the coalition, so it'll be a great marketing tool for them and their business. So how will they benefit? There's other benefits involved. And then the final column is who's going to be approaching that. And here's where it's always helpful to have a volunteer ask another volunteer to get involved. And so if you have a staff can go ask, but a volunteer could go with the staff. And say, I volunteer with this coalition. Here's the benefits I got out of it. Here's how you could get involved with the coalition. And so when we do our recruiting, moving into that aspect, we've identified what tasks our coalition's doing. We want to be able to recruit new members. Then we can prepare talking points, and we really can be thoughtful about engaging individuals and organizations. So you can see here we can prepare talking points, identify who's the best person to go contact this organization. If we're headed into, say we want to address a specific, say a principal at a school, well, we may need to go to the school superintendent first and just let that superintendent know that we would like to talk to the principal. And if the superintendent says yes, then we can go to the principal and say, hey, we spoke with your superintendent and he or she thinks it'd be a great idea for you to get involved. That's going to provide maybe some incentive for them to get involved. And also we want to clarify what is our expectation for their involvement. Maybe we'd like you to come just work on this assessment work group. And that's going to be involved for just 3 meetings. Here's what the assessment work group will do. So it's very clear expectations and also options for involvement. If they say, no, I can't do that work group, but I'd like to do something else, we can provide different options for them. And so in the workbook, we do provide a sample talking points for you, and these are fairly generic talking points, but they walk through, here's what we are, here's what we do, here's how you can get involved, these will be the benefits to you. So it does, again, we're doing this targeted one-on-one or recruiting. We want to be thoughtful about really providing a clear picture of what we're asking people to get involved with. And then another aspect of membership is recruiting and retaining members. And when people have done research on coalitions and asked, well, why do people stay involved with the coalition? There are several reasons. One reason is they have a clear role in the coalition, that they're actively engaged in doing something and making decisions with the coalition. That's why people stay involved. People also stay involved because they have relationships with people in the coalition. I just don't go to this meeting, I do my work, and I leave. They're members of the community, I'm working together. Coalition work can be fun, and so we need to engage in those sorts of energizers and activities. And finally, the third among the many reasons why people stay involved with coalitions is we're successful. And it may not be waiting 2 years for the survey to come out and say tobacco use decreased in our community. We'll be able to celebrate those successes, but also the little successes. Hey, we just got a new organization to take on and become tobacco-free and create a tobacco-free zone around their business. Or just we've recruited new members, or we've engaged in these strategies where young people have been involved in doing a smoke out. So whatever these small successes are, coalitions celebrate these successes. When we do this, people will be more likely to stay involved with the coalition. And so we just provide some tools for you to work with your coalition members. One is a coalition membership worksheet. Some coalitions do a periodic, whether it's an annual survey. And this worksheet allows you to identify how have individual members been involved with the coalition? What do they want to do with the coalition? What are some of the skills and resources they bring? So it really allows you to develop those relationships with individual coalition members. And then a second tool is an outline for an orientation manual. And so again, as we're recruiting people to come to the meeting, and before they come to meetings, we can orient them to what the work of the coalition is. What are the different elements and strategies that we're involved with? Who's involved with the coalition? Here's our action plans. Here's our strategies. Here's our assessment. The more people are aware of what the good work the coalition is doing, see how organized we are, they're more likely to want to stay with the coalition. So an orientation manual can be a small manual or it can include everything that the coalition is doing. It just provides transparency, provides people with information and say, hey, I may not want to be involved in this work group, but I like what this work group's doing. I'd love to be involved with that. So here's another potential for you to pause this webinar and think to yourself, how are we presently engaging people? What roles do we provide for people in the coalition? Do we have a good, strong leadership team? Do we have members who are involved? How are we doing our recruiting? Which brings us now to the next portion of this webinar, is to say, once we've got our organization, we've got people involved, we've got leaders, we've got members, how do we organize for success? And so here's where we're going to be talking about several tools that you can use to help the coalitions organize. And there are many different tools you see on this particular slide, everything from bylaws to memorandum of understanding to timelines, job descriptions. And what we like to say is you need these tools when you need them. When coalitions first start out, the first thing they may not start writing are bylaws. Again, we need to be moving toward recruiting and moving to action. As coalitions become more sophisticated, they may have funding, they may have several different strategies going on. We need bylaws to operate how we organize, how we operate, how we make decisions. So these tools are useful when you need them. And so what we want to do now is just walk through several of the tools. The first tool being some sort of organizational structure, and typically we define this by writing an org chart. When you have an organization chart for your coalition, it describes again, you can see here the roles, relationships, responsibilities. It allows you to start to say where decisions are made, what work groups are involved with the coalition, who has what lines of authority, meaning where the money is going. It really goes a long way for being transparent about the work of a coalition. And you can see here on this particular slide, here's just an example of a coalition org chart. And as you can see along the bottom are the different work groups. Those are where the work is being done. We have our general coalition. The work groups may be meeting once a month or periodically depending on the work group. The coalition may meet monthly or every other month. And then we have a steering committee, which is our leadership. So we may have a separate fiscal agent who we're running our money through, our finances through, and we may have coalition staff. So again, this clearly outlays where the work's being done, who's involved with the coalition. It's also a nice recruiting tool. People can look at it and say, I'd like to be involved in the data work group or the availability work group. Or someone may say, no, I want to be in a leadership role. I'd like to be on your steering committee. Or others may say, no, I'd just like to be involved as a coalition member, and I'll come to your meetings, and I'll get involved as I see fit. So the org chart provides that clarity, that transparency to the work of a coalition. Another tool, if you will, or another helpful way of looking at the coalition work is looking at what decisions are made and who is making those decisions. And so we typically identify decisions into three categories. The content, that's really the planning, the implementation. The operational, that's the big picture staffing, big picture funding of our coalition member recruiting. And then the operational or day-to-day decisions that are made. What color tablecloths we put on for our picnic, sending out meetings, and deciding what goes on the agenda. And so this is important because it identifies no one individual can and should be doing all these things. So how do we, I'm just going to go back to the org chart, how do we go back to our org chart and say which of these types of decisions are made by where? So which decisions will be made by the steering committee? Which decisions will work groups have the responsibility made for? If we have staff or people who are dedicated to work on the coalition, which decisions will they make? Which decisions do we need the fiscal agent? So again, this provides transparency, and it also allows us to diversify the decision making. And again, people stay more involved in coalitions when they have a say and are actively involved in the decision making of a coalition. So this is a nice tool to couple with the organization chart to identify roles and responsibilities. And then the final tool that we'll talk about here in this section is the timeline. And typically we think about timeline in this may be considered a Gantt chart, but it's looking at a timeline over the long term to say what are the broad activities that our coalition is doing. So the timeline allows us to be able to look at the level of work we're doing and really allocate our resources toward that. If we've got a whole bunch of strategies going on in April and May, then we need to do recruiting about that. Or if we just don't have the capacity to do that work, we need to reschedule some of those activities so they occur when we have more resources available. It's also a nice tool for when we're recruiting people to show them this timeline. And they may say, you know, I'm really busy. A busy time of the year for me is over the summer, but my workload decreases a little bit in the fall. What are some activities I can get involved with in the fall? So it is also a nice recruiting tool as well. It's also nice for accountability. We have starting points and end points. Are we doing what we said we're going to do? That helps build our credibility in the community that we are aware of doing things in the time frame that we established for them. And so the final concept to talk about under coalition organization is the idea of action orientation. A lot of this has to do with how we conduct our coalition meetings, to be very specific about this. In some coalitions, when they meet, the core group will get together, they'll plan the meeting, and then people come to the meeting, and it's a lot of information sharing, and people going around the room saying what they're doing. And there's not a lot of work that gets done at these meetings. When we talk about that, networking is important, but it can't be everything our coalition does. So when we talk about an action orientation, is for every meeting that we have, we try to look at and say, what decisions need to be made, what actions need to be planned. If you know what decisions or actions that need to be planned, then you can invite the right people. This goes back to what I talked about earlier with getting the right person to the right meeting at the right time. If we're going to be talking about doing a cessation program with one of our local businesses, okay, who needs to be involved in that cessation program? And when we get people at the table, what decisions do we need to be making? What plans do we need to be putting in place? So it's really about action and tasks and work that needs to be done. And so another way to do this action orientation is when we're sending out the agenda for a meeting ahead of time in the announcement, we can clearly say, even if you think about the little space when you open up an email, these are the decisions or actions that we're making during this meeting. And we need you to be here because we need your input into these decisions. Then during the meeting, you can talk about those. And when you send out the minutes of the meeting, you can say, okay, these are the decisions that were made. These were the actions that were planned. These are the people who have committed to doing these things. That's an action orientation because they know when I come to your meeting, we're going to be talking about doing work and actually doing work. And so this is in the workbook as well. We just wanted to provide an agenda from a coalition meeting. This is from the SNAP coalition that I volunteer with here in Portland. But if you look at the elements of this agenda, they have the topics, and then you notice they have the time frame for each topic. This is important because if I come to the meeting to talk about the third or fourth agenda item, and the coalition spends all meeting talking about the first and the second, then you've wasted my time in coming to your meeting. So it's important to have a time scheduled and set up to say, okay, we're going to cover this for 10 minutes, and when you get to that end of that 10 minutes, you can say, okay, do we need to move this to the next meeting? Do we need to assign this to a work group? We talk about this at the end of the meeting, but we need to respect people's time and the items on the agenda, because if it's on the agenda, it means it's important. Then you also look at the column that says who's going to be involved, and you notice there's a range of names here on this. This is important because the more people that are involved in running the meetings, the more people are involved in doing the work, it lets the coalition members, the attendees at that meeting, see that it's not one person leading it, that there's members getting involved, the members are modeling, getting involved. And this particular meeting, we have a paid staff, that the staff was not involved in any of these topics. The staff's role is supporting it. So we're really modeling that member-driven, volunteer-driven work action orientation of the coalition. And then the last column is the action or decision. For every agenda item, we try, with most of the time success, to really be able to clarify why is this item on the agenda? Do we need to make a decision? Do we need to do planning? Do we need to ask for volunteers to, for having a booth at the county fair? Who's going to staff that booth? So it's really an action or decision that needs to be made. That really leads to an action-oriented coalition, action-oriented meetings. Questions about this third section of the webinar, which is really talking about organization, how we organize to do it. So I would ask if you want to pause here and think about how might you use some of these tools, what are some of the different organizational techniques do we need to really provide that structure of our coalition. And so the last element of building coalition capacity is building cultural competence. And we clearly recognize we're not going to cover the full aspect of cultural competence here in 10 minutes. It is, but we do want to emphasize it is important to always be aware of cultural competence in everything we do. It's in the middle of the strategic prevention framework, so when we're doing assessment, capacity planning, implementation, evaluation, we're always looking to be culturally sensitive, culturally responsive to the diversity within our community. So when you look at this definition, which is provided by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, it's really talking about behaviors, attitudes, and policies. So it's not just giving lip service. Let's build things into our work of our coalition that enable us to function effectively in diverse elements of our community and be able to engage. When we talk about engaging the grassroots members of our community, we really need to understand the different culture and diversity that are represented throughout our community. So it's really about being aware of it. And so one way in is to look at different ways we define culture. And the culture, we know, is more than just race and ethnicity. So as we're going back to the first thing I talked about earlier, our definition of community, having a defined community, we want to be looking at all the different ways that people may be, all the different cultures within our community. And it goes back to our definition of community, also goes back to our assessment. When we understand our community, we can understand there may be some disparities based on these different types of diversity within our community. So it is everything from people's level of education that they're involved in, what is their occupation, what hobbies they're involved with, their age. Every different one of these has multiple aspects that impact our planning, impact how we recruit and engage people, also impact how we implement strategies. So we need to always be aware of the different cultures in our community. And the CACTA Cultural Competence Primer talks about cultural competence being a process. And the first element, the first two elements, our cultural knowledge and awareness. Before we can become culturally competent and take actions around our cultural competence, we really need to understand and have knowledge. What are all the different cultures in our community? What makes those cultures unique? Even within cultures, what's unique about the cultures within cultures? The more we can understand that, then we're better able to make decisions based on that knowledge. So it's first understanding what are the different cultures and the uniqueness of those cultures within our community. Once we have that, then we can then we will be able to achieve some of the benefits. So it's really about respecting and being sensitive to these different cultures. When we do that, then we're able to, these are all the benefits, able to basically bring people together in a way that we can be effective in doing the work that we want to do. It increases trust and cooperation, decreases some of the fear, some of the history that may have been involved in our community. Again, those first two steps of just reaching out to people and talking to them about their cultures and how they may want to become involved in the coalition, what are appropriate ways to engage their culture in the work of our coalition. And so as we're walking through the strategic prevention framework, and this is in your workbooks as well, as I said earlier, we can be culturally aware, culturally sensitive throughout. So in our assessment, capacity planning, and implementation, evaluation, we need to be aware of culture. For example, when we do our assessment, there are some cultures that don't like taking surveys, or if there's a culture that isn't literate in English, or they're not literate in reading at all, surveys won't be the right way to collect information from them. So we need to be aware of that and be able to count our data collection activities based on our knowledge of these different cultures. That sort of understanding permeates the entire strategic prevention framework. Another tool that we provide, and this is also in your workbook, is a cultural competence worksheet. This is a nice tool when you're looking at specific cultures. And when you're looking at a culture in your community, and this is to look at a specific culture, then you can say, how are we reaching out to that culture? Are we developing materials that are appropriate? Are we delivering materials that are appropriate for that culture? Do we have members from that particular culture involved in not just the implementation, but in the assessment and planning aspects of our work? So this worksheet is really helpful for us once we identify what are the different cultures in our community, what are different ways that we can make sure we're being responsive to the uniqueness of their culture. So that's a brief looking at the need to be culturally aware of the different cultures in our community. Also, that includes the major content where we've looked at, again, the first part was what is the role of our coalition, being able to clarify that, talking about building strong membership, which involves leadership and members. We talked about coalition organization, and we talked about being culturally competent. In your workbooks, there is a coalition capacity building checklist. That checklist allows you to be able to walk through and say, not we have to do everything right now, but what are some of these elements that are going to be important for us depending where we are in our coalition building, and talk about how we can build some of these elements of a successful coalition now as we engage people in doing more of this work of our coalition. And just to finish the formal portion of this content, I have mentioned that CADCA resources available. We do encourage you all to contact CADCA and also to contact our technical assistance manager. I mentioned this 1-800-54-CADCA extension 240, or send an email to training@cadca.org. And so this has been the first webinar. We've talked about building content. As Keith has mentioned, our further webinars will talk more about how we do some of that planning and assessment planning and implementation. With that, I'm going to turn it over back to you, Keith, to ask any questions or provide any final words for us.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate it. I think you've done a very good job with laying out the content for the first webinar. I would like to say that this concludes the first webinar of the three-part series. Remember to download the supplemental resources that accompany this training. The workbook in particular that Dave has referenced throughout the training will prove invaluable when executing the strategies that he has shared in this particular webinar. If you have any follow-up questions after you've viewed the webinar in its entirety, feel free to send them to Siglinda Prior, and she will forward them to us here at CACA. And we will work to provide responses to your questions. Thank you.